It is the first model introduced in the 2024 Nadesico collaboration with Medarot S, sporting the design of the iconic main Super Robo specialized in the series as a whole. It is KSN00 Adonish with a kit of Emit Hammer, Giga Gatling, Jet Hammer, biped legs, and the leg ability of Auto Charge, which passively fills Meta-Force gauge each turn its action is completed. Now, as a model sporting the iconic look of the design of Aestivalis, and I do correct on the enunciation if I did say it wrong, it is going to be a very powerful model at first glance, and looking at its overall kit, specializes almost exclusively in collateral and AoE spread type damage as a whole. Which is not to say it's a terrible model, because we've been most certainly getting a lot of scatter and AoE skills that are exceptionally powerful over the past year and a half, and past several patches, and this one is most certainly going to be no exception to that rule either. Emit Hammer on the head, and a brand new skill being introduced into the game. Well, I won't say it's a new skill entirely, because it basically falls in the same vein as we had with Emit Blade back with the Bravern collaboration. To explain it briefly, it will consume 30% of your charge gauge upon use, but in trade you also get double damage upon the consumption of that charge. The only real drawback to that is, while you're free to use it as many times as you please, if you do not have the amount of charge required to use Emit Hammer, you simply are not allowed to pick it at all on your turn. And given that it has a pretty solid base power there at almost 1700, it is honestly doubling that to about 3400, because it's going to be immensely painful when you are able to activate it. And because it's an AoE skill, that does mean it's going to damage all 4 parts normally, or spread load the damage across all active parts of the target when attacking them. Now, the only time that this AoE behavior is negated is if the enemy is using something like Conceal, which will sponge all the damage to one particular part, or if it's a defender that's intercepting it, of which the same behavior applies. Right Arm of Giga Gatling is a shooting-based attribute skill that is also a scatter type skill, which means it'll damage one part normally and then 2 others randomly at a third of your extra damage. Now, the thing about Giga Gatling, though, is that it actually has a much higher base damage than what the numbers are reading here, and it hits remarkably harder than what you really expect. The first of which is that it gets a times 1.5 damage bonus as long as the user's legs remain intact. However, the other added caveat to Giga Gatling is, unlike Mega Gatling, where the damage bonus is all you get, Giga Gatling also packs Defense Ignore on top of that. So in addition to already being notably stronger than what the base numbers are reading, you're also going to be ignoring the resistance stats of the enemy's legs when you attack them for just raw, unadulterated damage when you go to attack them. The only real drawback, of course, is the fact that you can't dodge or defend on cooldown, because it is notably strong on its own. And given that it also has a pretty high base heat and cool within the low to mid 800s, this is a skill that you can honestly use back and forth pretty reliably and pretty quickly, that doesn't really require a lot of setup to use. Just, of course, mind the no dodge and defend penalty on cooldown, and just make sure you have someone to cover him so that he doesn't get punished on the backswing as he's recharging. Jet Hammer on the left arm is a melee attribute skill, but which is also one of the first major times that we've seen this come up since the Go Nagai collaboration and Mazen Kaiser. Now, of course, this is also excluding the Dorcas, the crafty mode Dorcas C model, which also has it, but in case of a model that has it as an individual piece, this is the second in-game. To explain Jet Hammer briefly, much like Emit Hammer, it is an AoE type skill, so it will damage all active parts on the enemy equally and spread the damage. But it does also have a bit of a condition to get some extra damage out of it. And that condition is that the farther away the target is from the user, you get a damage boost on top of that. So if you manage to just barely catch somebody on the back end as you're towards the center line, you're probably not going to be dealing a lot of considerable damage. But the farther away from you, such as just as they're finishing their cooldown phase or just starting their heat phase of their next attack, that is where you're going to be really cooking that extra bonus damage. And while Adonish Singh really isn't designed to be breaking a lot of things consistently, say with pierce damage or even spot nuking on top of that, This model is more designed to be breaking a lot of things at once, rather equally, which is a very strange approach to doing it, but still rather in line with the original source material as well. Now, when it comes to leg stats, it's actually a pretty solid model as well. With the base speed at 916, it's already off to a very impressive start. And with an evade of 1051, it's not the greatest there is, but as long as you can keep your evade in the 1000 range, preferably higher, that's usually a really good sweet spot of where you want to keep it to have a fair chance of dodging or grazing consistently. Having a melee resist of 1375 and a shoot resist of 1038 means it's a fairly solidly well-rounded biped leg as well. So not only will it have pretty solid terrain coverage across most terrains that you would fight on, but its stats spread on the legs are also pretty well-rounded enough that you can use this leg on your melee fighter or your shooter and expect a pretty consistent performance either direction. Plus, auto charge actually is pretty solid as well, as it means for every action completed, you get an extra 10% fill into your Metaforce gauge, which actually ties pretty remarkably well into Emit Hammer if used correctly. And in the armor department, Adonish is packing about 4079 for the head, 3299 for the right arm, 3779 for the left, and 3899 for the legs. So he's a pretty chunky fellow with the exception of that right arm, which is going to be a little bit lighter on the armor. But otherwise, he's still a pretty well-rounded model, and despite having a pretty solidly, strangely synergetic in a way, but not kind of kit, it's still a pretty well-rounded model you really can't go wrong with using. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I do still have to rate Adonish a pretty well-rounded 7 out of 10. Its synergy is rather strange, but if you use it correctly, it can be a very destructive model for those very same reasons. Auto Charge and Emit Hammer, of course, will fit very well together with synergy. Saving Emit Hammer for just a handful of uses after you build a charge with other skills is a good way to make use of it and still exercise the use of your turns without actually wasting them. Giga, Gatling, and Jet Hammer also pretty solid too for its overall damage output. Jet Hammer is probably going to be the most conditional next to Emit Hammer, though, because it does require that distance condition to really capitalize on its bonus. As mixed parts, I do have to rate him equally at a 7 out of 10 for these same reasons. Like I said, the synergy with his kit is there, but it's also strangely not. You do have to kind of think really carefully on how you're going to use this model in your teams if you plan to use them at all. But if you plan to mix up the parts, such as, say, pairing Auto Charge with another Metaforce-reliant attack, such as Hyper Beam, Beam Sword, Ghost, or Ghost Shot, or something similar, then you can really start cooking with something else that can benefit from that kind of skill outside of just Emit Hammer, and give Adonish just a little bit more viability and versatility while on the field.